Consider what American industry delivered when it mattered. During World War II, the United States sent 152,000 trucks to the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease program, Studebakers mostly. Stalin himself sent a letter to Studebaker praising the quality of the truck. Soviet soldiers who had been driving through the mud of the Eastern Front in their own vehicles called the American Studebaker a lifesaver. The Red Army mounted their famous Katyusha rocket launchers on Studebaker truck chassis because the American frames were the only ones tough enough to handle the recoil. The truck that helped win the Second World War was an American civilian design. And after the war ended, the people who ran this country remembered that. They built an entire national defense strategy around it. The military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned about in 1961 was not just about tanks and missiles and bombers. It was about keeping American factories capable, American engineers employed, American manufacturing standards high enough that when the call came, the line between a work truck and a war machine could be crossed in months. Your 1972 Chevy C10 with the 350 small block that ran for 30 years without a major repair was not an accident of simpler times. It was the end product of a national security policy that demanded American industry build things that lasted. Then, 1991 happened. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Berlin Wall had already come down 2 years earlier. The Cold War was over. And almost immediately, something changed in American manufacturing that nobody talked about directly, but everyone in a factory felt. The reason to overbuild was gone. Between 1989 and 1999, the United States cut its defense budget by nearly a third. The military-industrial complex that had shaped American manufacturing for 40 years began to shrink. The factories that had been kept capable and strong because of the Soviet threat started consolidating, started optimizing, started asking the question that the Cold War had kept off the table for 4 decades. How cheap can we make this? General Motors no longer needed a truck frame that could theoretically be converted to military use. Ford no longer needed engine tolerances that could survive conditions beyond a suburban commute. The hidden standard that had made American trucks legendary, the silent government requirement baked into every casting and every weld and every frame rail, quietly disappeared. What replaced it was a window sticker, a fuel economy number, a monthly payment calculation, corporate engineers designing for a government test score instead of for a scenario that no longer kept anyone up at night. The 2024 Silverado, with its active fuel management lifters failing at 80,000 miles and its class action lawsuits and its $10,000 repair bills, is not a coincidence. It is the product of an industry that no longer has a reason to overbuild. The pressure that produced the cast-iron Vortec engine and the fully boxed steel frame and the axles that lasted 300,000 miles without complaint is gone. It left in 1991, and it took the trucks with it. The men who are hunting pre-1990 American trucks right now are not chasing nostalgia. They're chasing engineering standards that have not existed in a new vehicle for 30 years. They're finding those standards in 1970s C10s and 1980s square-body Chevys and early 1990s F-150s with the straight six, in trucks that were built when an invisible hand was on the shoulder of every engineer in Detroit whispering, "This has to last. This has to work. This cannot fail." That hand belonged to the Cold War. The men who drove those trucks worked hard their whole lives. They did not know they were driving machines that had been quietly shaped by one of the most consequential geopolitical rivalries in human history. They just knew the truck started every morning and ran every day and never asked for much in return. That was not an accident. That was America when it had something to prove. What was the oldest American truck you ever owned or drove that just wouldn't die, no matter what you did to it? Drop the year and the model in the comments below, because I want to see what the Cold War built. And I want every person watching this who is about to sign a $70,000 truck payment to read those comments first. Hit subscribe. There is a lot more of this kind of history coming, the kind they never put in the brochure. Somewhere in a government archive in Washington, D.C., there is a document most Americans have never read. It was written in 1950. It was classified for decades, and it contains a single sentence that explains something your grandfather knew in his bones but could never quite put into words. Why the truck he drove in 1965 never broke down. Why the truck your father drove in 1978 was still running in 1995. Why mechanics from that era look at what comes out of a factory today and shake their heads and walk away. The answer has nothing to do with American craftsmanship, nothing to do with simpler times or harder working people. The answer has a name, and that name is the Soviet Union. In 1950, the United States government was terrified. Not the kind of terrified you see in press conferences, the kind of terrified that gets written into classified policy documents and shapes every decision a country makes for the next 40 years. The Soviet Union had just tested its first nuclear bomb. China had just fallen to communism. North Korea had just crossed the 38th parallel with 75,000 soldiers, and a policy document called NSC 68 landed on President Truman's desk that said in plain language, "Our military strength is becoming dangerously inadequate, and our very independence as a nation may be at stake." What followed was the longest continuous wartime mobilization in American history. Not a war, a permanent state of readiness. From 1947 to 1991, the United States spent nearly $13 trillion preparing for a conflict that never arrived. Defense spending hit 10% of the entire American economy during the 1950s. Every factory, every manufacturer, every company that made anything that could be used in a war was brought into the equation, including the companies that made your truck. Here is what most people have never been told about American truck manufacturing between 1950 and the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. The federal government needed something specific from civilian manufacturers, something that had been proven absolutely critical during World War II. In 1941, when America entered the war, the factories that were making passenger cars and light trucks were converted almost overnight to military production. It worked. The industrial base was strong enough and the engineering was compatible enough that the transition happened faster than anyone thought possible. General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, International Harvester, all of them retooled and all of them delivered. The lesson the Pentagon took from that experience was simple and permanent. If the Soviet Union ever pushed across Western Europe, the United States would need to do it again, fast. The civilian truck manufacturing base had to be kept strong. The engineering had to stay compatible with military requirements. The factories had to be capable of switching. This meant one thing for every truck that rolled out of an American factory between roughly 1950 and the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. It had to be overbuilt. Not for the farmer pulling a hay bale, not for the contractor hauling lumber, for a scenario that the engineers and the executives and the government procurement officers all had somewhere in the back of their minds every single day. What happens if we have to put this on a battlefield? Cast iron engine blocks that could survive conditions nobody advertised on a window sticker. Full steel ladder frames that a military engineer could look at and say, "Yes, this will do." Axles and differentials with tolerance margins that exceeded anything a civilian owner would ever need. Your grandfather's truck was not built tough because someone in Detroit cared about his commute. It was built tough because someone in Washington was watching Moscow.